This morning's scripture reading will be taken from Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 14. Again, that's Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 14. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the river among the reeds. And she sent her maid to get it. Oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. I skipped some. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maiden to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. She said, she had compassion on him and said, "This is the one, the Hebrews' children." Then her sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, a saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at the burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked his way, and he looked that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, two Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" Then he said, "Who made you the prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?"
On November 8th of this year, most of us will go to our local community center, maybe the elementary school lobby, where you will walk into a voting booth, look up at a big computer screen there, raise your finger, swallow hard, and vote for someone to be the next president of the United States. And even if maybe or even hopefully this election is kind of a once-in-a-generation anomaly, it's never easy to vote for president. Whoever is elected to be president will have a national constituency. That's 325 million people, which means that almost no one who votes for these candidates will actually know them. So that puts us as the voters in a tough spot. I mean, we've got the job of selecting who's going to have this incredibly important office, but we have to choose among people that we don't know and almost certainly never will. And that's one of the main reasons why we have political parties. So the idea being that if I have certain political ideas and objectives and you have the similar ideas and objectives and other people across the city and the state and the region and across the country have those same ideas, then we'll all get together as a group, we'll select one of our members, and we'll hold that man, that woman up as our nominee. And that way, since I don't know who this person is, but I know they're a member of this party, so I'll vote for him or her. And given sort of the limitations of our national system, that is a totally legitimate way to select who we'll vote for, so long as we understand that it's not perfect. And it's not perfect, mostly because, well, the barrier to entry to a political party is extremely low. If you want to be a member of a political party, all you have to do is register. You just sign up. There's no entrance exam. There's no political policy pledge you have to make. You sign up and you're in. And if you can convince enough members of that party to nominate you, then you're going to be on that ballot with a little R or a little D beside your name, and hundreds of thousands or millions of people that don't know you and never will vote for you if for no other reason than because of that R or that D. And American politics is littered with examples of elected officials who disappointed their voters because they didn't live up to what they thought the party stood for. And so some voters say, you know what, I'm fed up with the party system. I'm not going to vote that way. I've got another system. I'm going to actually dig a little bit, and I'm going to find out these candidates' voting records. If you really want to know, you can find that information out. Every vote they ever cast, every measure they ever supported, every bill that they ever sponsored. You can find that information if you really want to know it. That's a good system too, but again, not perfect. Because really, who has the time to do that? Plus, even if you do, what about the candidate that's never run for office before? He or she doesn't have a voting record. What do you do with them? And so still other voters say, okay, I don't like the party system. I can't find out their voting records. So they say, well, maybe I'll just go about just looking for general characteristics of a good leader, regardless of what they stand for. Are they or are they not a good leader? Do they have those characteristics? That's, what I like to do. Look for leadership characteristics. Things like, do they have what you might refer to as grace under fire? When things go bad, and things are going to go bad at some point or another, can they handle it well? Do they keep things under control, themselves and everyone that they're leading? And then what about something like consistency? Are they consistent? Whatever their policy is, do they keep it or do they change it? Other than a criminal, about the worst thing you can call a politician is a flip-flopper. Consistency is important. And then how about something like relatability? I mean, our elected officials are supposed to be our representatives, and so it'd be nice if we feel like they actually relate to us, that they can truly represent us. Again, I think that's a legitimate way to decide who you'll vote for, but again, not perfect. The passage that was just read to you proves that that system is not perfect. Because here in Exodus chapter 2, Moses is about to be made the leader of the Israelites. Now we know God made that decision. God chose Moses to be the leader of the Israelites. But hypothesize with me for just a second. Hypothetically, if that had been an elected office, leader of the Israelites, and I had been alive and eligible to cast a ballot, I would not have voted for Moses. And I highly doubt that most of the Israelites of his day would have voted for Moses either. Because in that early part of his life, Moses didn't have any of those characteristics of leadership that I just described. Grace under fire? Exodus chapter 2 at verse 11. Moses goes out and he sees something that was an injustice, one man hurting another man. And instead of discussing it with him civilly and trying to have a conversation about what has just happened, he kills the man with his bare hands and buries him in the sand. Well, we can't have that among our leaders, right? That's no good. So no grace under fire. That's strike number one. Then what about consistency? Well, go to the next verse in verse 12. And the very next day, after he has killed and buried this man, he sees two other people fighting. He walks up to them, and now he's preaching nonviolence. And they call him on it and say, Moses, we just saw you kill that guy. So there's strike number two. And then what about relatability in his early days? I doubt many of the Israelites considered Moses to be relatable. He didn't grow up with them. He didn't experience what they experienced as children. He spent the first 40 years, or most of it, with the Egyptians. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't relatable. That was strike number 3. I wouldn't have voted for him. I doubt many of the Israelites would have. I guess it's luckily then that this wasn't an election, that God chose him. And you go over to Exodus chapter 3, and there's a great story there about God's conversation with Moses at the burning bush, and all the things we can understand there about how Moses actually became the leader of the Israelites. That's a great story to consider, but it's not the story we want to consider this morning. Because before Moses could become the leader of the Israelites, he first had to become an Israelite. Well, hold on a second. Moses was born an Israelite, right? His mom and dad were both Israelites, and his nationality was an ascribed status, not an earned or a chosen one. That's true. But Moses' cultural identity as an Israelite was absolutely his choice. Hebrews chapter 11 at verse 25 says Moses chose Israel. And at the time that he made that choice, it was kind of an odd one. And that's what we want to consider this morning. Why did Moses choose Israel? What does that choice tell us about how he viewed his world? And what does that choice teach us about how we should see our world? That's what we want to talk about here this morning. But we need to start at the beginning, back when Moses was born. When Moses was born, he was born into a very tenuous political situation. The Israelites were living in someone else's country. They had been driven to Egypt by famine, and they had been, let's say, tolerated there for about a generation by a benevolent Pharaoh who thought he owed something to Joseph, who had done a lot of good things in Egypt and made a lot of people rich there. And so for a generation, the Egyptians tolerated the Israelites out in the corner, staying there and doing their farming, and the Egyptians allowed them to stay there for a while. And it was a very prosperous generation for the Israelites. Exodus chapter 1 at verse 7 says that they grew in large numbers during that generation. But that generation passed, a new generation arose, and the new Pharaoh came to power, and he didn't know Joseph anything. In fact, he didn't really know who Joseph was. All he knew is that there's this huge group of foreigners out there at the edge of my kingdom that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and all that signaled to him was there's a big threat out there. Now, even though the Israelites had never done anything to antagonize the Egyptians, this Pharaoh just thought these foreigners are going to try to take over my country. And so he set out a two-part plan to deal with these Israelites, these people out there that were some hypothetical threat to him. Part one of the plan, which is in Exodus chapter 1 at verse 12, is that he would show them who's boss. Verse 11, excuse me. He would show them who's boss. There's maybe a lot of you, but this is our country and we're in control. And so he enslaved them. He put them to work doing menial labor for no money. That's one way to put your foot down, to show them who's in charge, who's running this place. No matter how many of them there are, we're in control and you're going to do as we say. But that wasn't enough, because the real problem, the real threat, he thought, was just how many of them there were. And sure, you could enslave them, but that's not going to deal with the population problem that they had. So part two of this terrible plan, verse 15 and 16, is this terrible order that he put in place, basically saying, every new Israelite boy who's born, kill him. That's the environment in which Moses was born. Surviving his birth was a crime. That's the environment in which he was born. If he survived 2 days, it was only by the providence of God, and it was by the providence of God, and he did survive. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. His mom and dad have this child, and for those first 3 he is born, and he survives that day. He survives day 2, and we think, well, maybe he's out of danger, but no, of course, since his life is a crime in and of itself, every new day that he lives is illegal. And so every new day is a danger to him and his family. So his mom does what she can, and she hides the child for 3 months. 3 months, this child is hidden, or otherwise he's going to die. And so after those 3 months, she can't hide him anymore. And so she does what she thinks is about the only thing left that she can do for her son, whose life is in danger at every moment that he becomes visible. And so she takes the child, she puts him in the ark, in the basket as it were. She goes down to the Nile River, and by the river, in the reeds there, she drops the basket, and then she walks away. Now, this lesson this morning is about Moses, but stop for a second and think about his poor mother for just a moment. Can you imagine being in a circumstance as a mother where the very best thing that you can do for your 3-month-old little boy is to put him down and to walk away? That's all she could do for him. And so she did. And as he's put down, his sister, his older sister, who we later learned is named Miriam, we see her in Exodus 2 at verse 7, she stands alongside. She wants to see what's going to happen to her little brother. Probably nothing good, or likely nothing good. But as it turns out, Pharaoh's daughter walks by, and she picks up the child. She has pity on the child, and she decides that she will raise him as her own. And then the story gets a little strange, or at least a little strange to us, because Miriam, the sister, stands there and sees her little brother picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and says to the Pharaoh's daughter, you need to get someone to nurse this child, someone to help him in these very young months. And so, as it were, Miriam takes Pharaoh's daughter and this young child and suggests, or seems to say, she suggests that the mother herself, his birth mother, be the one to actually nurse this child. And so, the mother, having lost her child, is now, for at least a few months, able to have him back. And after the child is weaned, we read there in verses 9 and 10, then Pharaoh's daughter takes the child back. And now Moses' mother has lost him twice. She takes him back and she raises him as his own. Moses is only Moses, we read in verse 10, because that's what Pharaoh's daughter decided to name him. And so that was Moses' very odd, very strange, unusual, and unsettled childhood. It's somewhat of a wonder to us when you think about it in those terms as to how Moses became a functional adult. If you've ever been to a family court, you ever served as a guardian ad litem, you've ever been a public school teacher, you've seen a lot of children who come from a very unsettled backgrounds. And when they do, it can place extreme burdens on their development. You see that here, right? The fact that Moses became a highly functional adult is in of itself somewhat impressive, given the circumstances of his young life. But after that unsettled and unsettling childhood, things really started to get much better for Moses, at least temporally speaking, because now he is the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's pretty good. He had hit the social lottery in Egypt. He's not at the bottom anymore, down where with the Israelites, who, as we read in Exodus chapter 1 at verse 14, continue to live in slavery, and not a particularly nice form of slavery. Verse 14 says that the Egyptian slave drivers, at Pharaoh's demand, treated them ruthlessly. And so it was understandable, or it would have been understandable, if Moses was just completely confused in his mind about his cultural identity, who he was born to be, who he grew up to be, who his family was, and what kind of life he was supposed to live. But it did get better. He lived as Pharaoh's daughter's son. He was, if not on track certainly to be king, he was on track to be an Egyptian aristocrat. Things were going to go pretty well for him. Life was going to be pretty good. Moses actually doesn't tell us much about that early part of his life. We get a little bit more detail from when Stephen retells the story in Acts chapter 7. If you reach Acts chapter 7 at verse 22, we see what Moses was doing during that early part of his life after he had been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 22 says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and in action. So he got, as a result of being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, to go to the very best schools, enjoy the very best of culture, and rise to the very highest of society. And that was pretty good. Egyptian society was the most advanced society of the day. He got to go to their schools, learn their astrology, and to learn their mathematics and their science, all that good stuff. At the end of verse 22, when Stephen says that he was powerful in speech and action, he was well respected. And at the very top of Egyptian culture, things were going pretty well. That had become, and that was going to be his life going forward. If nothing changed, if Moses just lived out his days, he was on track to live in the Egyptian palace, or the equivalent of the Egyptian palace, and to be at the top of Egyptian society. That was who he was, or who he had been allowed to become. But we're talking this morning about this choice that he made between Egypt and Israel. And he chose, as we of course know, Israel. And the question then becomes, why did he do it? I mean, from the standpoint of where he was after he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, it really doesn't seem like that hard of a choice at all. Here's the choice: continue to live in the royal palace or go live out there with those working the fields. Seemed pretty simple. It didn't seem like much of a choice at all. He could continue to live in the royal palace or to voluntarily join, a race of people that his adoptive grandfather hated so much that he had systematically subjugated them and really tried to eradicate altogether. In simplest terms, Moses' decision came down to this: all other things being equal, would you rather be a slave or a prince? That was his choice. Then we read there in Exodus chapter 2 at verse 11, and we see him making this choice. So he walks out of his royal accommodations in Egypt, and where he was with his family, his friends perhaps, of course the Egyptians that he had went to school with, and had this life that was building for himself. He left his royal accommodations and he went out to where the Israelites were. And then we see that we have this Egyptian beating this Hebrew man, this Israelite. And so now this choice is put right in front of him. Here's the Egyptian, here's the Israelite, here's Moses, and the choice now has to be made. Perhaps this was, and at least Stephen suggests in Acts chapter 7, this was the very first time he'd been out there to see how things were going for the Israelites. And now that choice is put right in front of him. Here's the Egyptian, here's the Israelite, here's Moses. The choice is now has to be his. And there are questions that arise immediately from verse 11, like, why did he go out there at all? The Egyptians are who he'd spent most of his almost 40 years with now. That's where he had gone to school. Those were the people who had raised him, who he had spent almost all of his time. Why did he go out there at all? Why did he need to see this? And then the second question, of course, is, as we see in verse 11 and then again in verse 12, why did he choose the Israelite? Why did he side with the Israelite on this occasion? I wish that it was just as easy as just reading one more verse and getting the answer. But unfortunately, it seems like probably the answer, the total direct answer, lies somewhere between verse 10 and verse 11. Because we have this huge jump of time. And verse 10, Pharaoh's daughter is raising this little boy, Moses. He's just been weaned. He's just come back from his mother. And Pharaoh's daughter is now raising him. He's just, a year or two old. And then in verse 11, when it says Monday, after Moses had grown up, he's 40 years old there. So we've got 37, 38 or more years that Moses just doesn't talk about. He just doesn't tell us what he was doing or how he was spending his time. And if not for the fact that we have that little note in Acts chapter 7 about where he went to school and how he was prominent in Egyptian culture, we really wouldn't know anything about what he did during that period of time that may inform our understanding of why he made this seemingly odd choice. Thankfully, though, God does not leave us without an answer, and that brings us to Hebrews chapter 11. That's where we get the answer. Why did Moses make this choice? Why choose Israel? Why do this, given where you were, who you were, and what you had access to in Egypt? Hebrews 11 at verse 24 says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25 adds that it was by faith that he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God. That was his choice, and it was a choice that was made by faith. That's the answer to the question. But that's not the end of the discussion. Because here's something we know about faith, biblical faith. Biblical faith is never blind. Never blind. At the beginning of this very chapter, Hebrews 11 at verse 1, it says that faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the, depending on your translation, it is the assurance, it is the evidence, or it is the conviction of things not seen. So that tells us that faith is belief plus evidence. So for example, you believe that there is a God, but you don't believe it on a whim. You believe it based on evidence. Things like, as Romans chapter 1 tells us, that the existence of God is evident from the things around us, from the order and the sophistication of our world around us. We get evidence that God exists, and therefore we believe it. That's faith. You believe that Jesus is God's Son, but again, not on a whim. You believe it based on evidence, that Jesus himself accepted it in Matthew 16 when Peter confessed it. Or most directly in Matthew chapter 3, after Jesus was baptized, he rises from the water, the voice comes down from heaven, God himself, and he says very simply, this is my son. You believe it because you have evidence to support it, and that's faith. By faith, Moses chose Israel. So the question then becomes, where's the evidence? What is it in Moses' world that convicted him that choosing Israel was the wise decision? Was the prudent decision? Was the righteous decision? Where's the evidence? What convinced him that that was the right thing to do? We get another hint back from the verse we just read, back in Exodus chapter 2. Flip back there once more. We'll read verse 11 in its entirety once more. We get a little hint here as to maybe what was going through Moses' mind, what the evidence was that convicted him that choosing Israel under these circumstances was good or was wise or was righteous. Read along with me as I read verse 11, and notice the phrase that he uses twice here in verse 11. He says, one day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Did you catch that? Did you see the phrase that he uses twice there in verse 11 to describe the seemingly inexplicable choice as to why he chose Egypt over Israel? It says that he went out to where these things were taking place. He left his royal accommodations among the Egyptians. He went out to where the slave Israelites were. He looked this way and he looked that way, and he said, these are my people. These are my people. Now I imagine, and probably she wasn't there, but I imagine when she hears tell of this, wonder what Pharaoh's daughter is thinking. I think she's raising her hand saying, hold on a second, Moses. I rescued you. I raised you. You wouldn't have survived to your first birthday without me. You wouldn't be Moses without me. And you're going to side with them. They're your people and not us. You've spent almost 40 years with us, your entire life nearly, with us. You're one of us. Why are you saying that you are one of their people or they are your people? What is it with that phrase? And I don't imagine that Moses was seeming to be ungrateful here, but it's almost as if he's come to this great realization in this moment, or maybe over time. But he certainly has realized it here in this moment. This great realization that what he shared with these poor slave Israelites was so much more important than what he had shared with these Egyptians. he didn't really even know these Israelites. He hadn't spent any time with them. He didn't know these people. He knew these people for 40 years. And he says, these are my people. What I share with them is more important than what I have shared with you. You know, the first thing that God says to Moses at that burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 at verse 6, Exodus chapter 3 at verse 6, the first thing that God says to him after telling him to take his shoes off, the first thing that God says to him is, I am the God of your father. It didn't matter where he had spent those last 38 years. His relationship with these people was more important. These were his people. There's a lot tied up in that phrase, my people. These are my people. You know, I even hear that from time to time today, right? Maybe it's just a Southern thing, but when we talk to each other and we ask each other, where are you from? Where's your hometown? I've heard people say this before. They say, well, I've got people in Tennessee and Alabama and all over the place. I've got people here, there, and the other. And we use that phrase today to say that we have people. And what do we mean by that? I don't even think it's really a religious thing. That people, religious, non-religious, all of us would say we have these people in our lives. What do we mean when we use that phrase? Well, let's take just a silly example maybe and think about how you can determine who your people are this morning. So when you imagine tonight you're in bed, it's 3 a.m. and you are sound asleep, and then your phone rings. So you reach over to the night table where your phone is, you pick up your phone, and you look at the caller ID, and you see who's calling, and then you got a choice to make. You got a green button and a red button. The green button means you're going to pick it up and talk to this person. The red button means that you get to go back to sleep. It's 3 a.m., that red button looks really, really good. But if you see the name of who's calling you at 3 a.m. and you hit the green button, whoever's calling you, that's one of your people. That's one of your people. And when that person on the other end of the line starts telling you what kind of trouble they're in, and well, let me say this, if you're calling me at 3 a.m., you better be in trouble. But when they tell you what kind of trouble you're in, you then feel this tug within you that's telling you to then roll out of bed, to go to wherever they are, and to help them however you can. That's what it means to have people. People that you have this relationship with, that you feel this tug, that when they're in trouble, you want to help them however you can. And like you said, that's not just a Christian thing. Most people in the world today would say they have people like that. Family members mostly, probably some close friends maybe, probably not coworkers or people we don't know as well. The point, though, we want to make this morning is that for us as Christians, that group has to be a little bit bigger. Our people. That group has to be actually quite a bit bigger. In 1 Peter chapter 2, at verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2, at verse 9. Peter describes for us how big this group of people is. Our people, as Christians, actually is. 1 Peter chapter 2 at verse 9. Here, notice how he phrases. He says, but you are a chosen people. There's that phrase again. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. So who is he describing? Well, it's this group. It's these people. But who is it? The remainder of the verse says, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. So this group of people we're talking about here is everyone who's been called out of darkness into his marvelous light. So that would include generally Christians overall, not just the ones on your pew or on your row or in this building, but in general, those are our people. And in fact, it even gets bigger than that. In Acts chapter 16, verses 9 and 10, Acts 16, verses 9 and 10, the Macedonian call, as we call it, as Paul, on one of his missionary journeys, is going in one direction, preaching, teaching the gospel, and building up churches in one part of the region. And then he has this vision, as the story goes, in verse 9. And the vision is of a man of Macedonia, a place he'd never been to before. And the phrase that the man says in this vision is, come over to Macedonia and help us. That's the 3 a.m. phone call. And the question then becomes to Paul, are these your people or are they not your people? And so notice what it says in verse 10, that after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once, that's him rolling out of bed at 3 a.m., and went over to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And so here we have Paul extending the group of our people even bigger. So 1 Peter tells us it's Christians in general, all Christians. Here in Acts chapter 16, Paul tells us that this group of people is not only all Christians, but all those who could potentially become Christians. That's how big this group of people actually gets, our people. And that's part of what Moses' choice teaches us, who we should consider to be our people and how we should consider to deal with that fact. You know, I see examples of this all over this room. What about our Haitian missionaries that go back and forth to Haiti all the time, or from time to time? They went there this summer. Maybe you didn't think about it this way, or under these terms, but it's that country, which is the least prosperous country in the Western Hemisphere. When you hear the difficult circumstances they face, not only physically, but spiritually, that there are Christians there that are surrounded by an indigenous religion that is very hostile to Christianity, and they have difficult circumstances, not just physically, but spiritually. When you hear that, there's a group of people here who decided to get up and go. Because to you, and maybe you didn't think about it in these terms, those are your people. Those are our people too. On a plane somewhere right now, coming back from Kenya, is another group of people who have those same ideas. That they look at the Christians in East Africa and they realize that sometimes they're in trouble or they've got difficult circumstances, that over there are villages without churches. There are churches without qualified teachers. And most gallingly, there are Christians over there that don't have access to the scriptures in their native language. That's the most galling to me. I checked this morning. I have 6 copies of the English Bible in my living room. I have 2 additional copies on my phone at all time. And there are people in East Africa that don't have access to one in their native language. And so this congregation hears things like that, collects several thousands of dollars to buy Bibles for them. And there are other people who are not here this morning, they're on their way back, that hear things like that. And they say, even though I don't share a culture or a country with these people, or a continent with these people, they're still my people. So they grab their passport and some anti-malarial drugs and they're on a plane to East Africa, because those are our people. And you don't need a passport to do this. You see this all other places around this congregation. Things like the Bible correspondence classes. People perhaps that are incarcerated or otherwise in difficult circumstances. Those are our people too. There's the SALT project. There is knocking on doors for things like 12 questions. There are all of these things. People you don't know. People you don't have any relationship with. They're all our people, as that phrase is used in this passage. That's why Moses made that choice. We don't have time to get into it in great detail. But I want to finish this morning back in Hebrews chapter 11. There's another kind of reason why Moses made this choice, why he chose Israel over Egypt. Things were going great in Egypt. Life was really good, probably a lot better than he ever expected it to be or had any right to expect for things to be. Things were going good, but he chose Israel. Why? Verse 24 says, by faith Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than all the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. So the second reason that Moses made this seemingly strange choice is because he understood the value of God's reward. He understood the value of God's reward. This is something that we as human beings aren't good at, just in general. Understanding the difference between a daily on this earth reward and the reward that lies in wait for us in heaven. We're not good at that. We're really not good at that kind of thing. There's a whole field of sociology developed to why we're so bad at this. Short-term rewards versus long-term rewards. And you'll see sometimes they'll do these experiments just to try to prove how bad we are at this. They call it hyperbolic discounting. And here's how the basic experiment works. They offer 100 people and they say, I will give you $1 today, or I will give you $5 next week. 40% of people would say, I'll take the $1 today, as opposed to the $5 from next week. We're bad at it. Bad at determining short-term versus long-term rewards. But Jesus tells us in John chapter 14, first couple of verses, that in my Father's house are many mansions. And I don't really like necessarily that word mansions. Many resting places, many places where we can be, that he is preparing for us. Do we truly appreciate what a great reward is out there for us? We can have that. We don't deserve it. We'll never earn it. But God's willing to give it to us if we're willing to do what he asks us to here on earth. So I'm going to offer that this morning as the lesson and just ask you to think about that. I would ask yourself this question: who are my people and what am I doing for them? And what am I willing to do for them? But as that second part of the lesson, those verses there in Hebrews chapter 11, ask yourself, how much do you want that reward? And are you living the life that's necessary in order to receive it? If you're not a Christian this morning, there's an opportunity that you have. And we don't know how many more we're going to have. If you've not been added to the body of Christ, then you're not going to receive that reward. That's not my call. It's no one here's call. That's God's call. But he's told us very clearly how he's going to make it. Do what he says, be faithful to him, and receive that great reward. Anything less or other than that, and we're just not going to get there. And so if you're not on the track that leads to that great reward, we would encourage you to become a Christian this morning. We are hearing the word of God, and if you believe these things to be true, you're willing to confess the name of Jesus as Christ, if you're willing to put the Lord on in baptism and having repented of your sins, then you can rise to new life, and then you'll be on track for that great reward. If you are a Christian and you're thinking this morning that something that's been said, something you've read, or something that's been on your mind this week is making you think, I need to rededicate my life to Christ, or I just need prayer right now for something I'm struggling with, now's a great time to make those things known. If anyone needs to respond to the Lord's invitation, please come. Together we stand and sing.